first of all, just if you could just introduce yourself and give us a brief summary of your project.
So I'm Matthew Cotton, Professor of Public Policy at Teesside University, kind of co-led with Professor David Tyfield at Lancaster University, this project, sort of CarbonFreePorts, which basically was looking at the development of the Freeports agenda as it kind of emerged as an idea, and we kind of thought, well, this is an interesting opportunity for sort of changing the kind of economic and transport landscape of the what's sometimes referred to as these kind of left behind regions, these often kind of coastal regions, and so it was sort of about trying to look at the way in which we could kind of align the so-called levelling up agenda, which was about trying to sort of regrow these regions and kind of bring economic growth back to areas that were kind of falling behind in terms of manufacturing capacity and other aspects of economic growth, with the kind of low carbon agenda. What we wanted to do is to look and see partly how well those two policy agendas aligned, and also whether or not we could kind of intervene by introducing this idea of a sort of a carbon-free port. Could these places become centres of innovation in low carbon transport, as well as just these two things sort of happening in isolation of one another? That was really the original idea, was just about creating sort of frictionless trade. But I suppose the question is whether or not a free port is just that, or is it something else? And we found through our sort of qualitative research with different stakeholders, kind of regionally in Teesside and in the Liverpool city region, that wasn't really the case, that the original idea of sort of low tariff trade was less important than the investment capital and building kind of low carbon innovation centres within those regions. So it was more about putting a spotlight on the region and providing a mechanism to kind of build industry, really, was really what most of the stakeholders cared about, more than the actual nuts and bolts of having a low tax kind of region for trade and export. So
okay, so the low tax environment was an enabler for something else.
Yeah, and also that it was just less important, or it was seen as less important than I think we had anticipated, and was stressed in the policy itself, if that makes sense. And so we spoke to people from both these kind of regional mayoral authorities who were directly involved in the bid, but also things like local activists working on the sort of Save the Sefton Valley. We spoke to councillors involved in sustainable development planning. I'm trying to think of other people we talked to. So obviously using a kind of sort of snowball sampling approach, where we are trying to speak to people and get them to recommend others that we can speak to. And we did some sort of stakeholder mapping to see who the different stakeholder groups would be, and then tried to sample from there.
What in particular do you see as the kind of decarbonisation opportunities that this kind of initiative has unlocked, or could unlock?
Yeah, so I think there's two elements. One was about the kind of the environmental impact and the sort of possibilities of transport decarbonisation in and out of the sites, because when you look at the Freeport overall, they're quite distributed. Actually, the two ones that we looked at. So Liverpool City Region 1 goes from the port more or less all the way up to the kind of Manchester kind of shipping canal, and it's quite distributed across this kind of this region. And so that creates a whole range of transport issues, particularly if you think about increased freight for, to kind of support the Freeport. And essentially none of that kind of local transport planning across the region really factored the Freeport into account. So that was one of the kind of key findings, was that the kind of local transport issue wasn't really factored into the design of these Freeport plans, and that was something that they needed to take into account, in part because certainly in the Liverpool City region there was a lot of kind of local activism and concern amongst local councils around the expansion of road networks and problems of freight in particular, moving through kind of suburban communities and Sefton Park and those kinds of things. So so we had quite a lot to say on that side of things around the sort of local transport networks and how those could be better managed. But more broadly, I think partly because sort of net zero has become the sort of banner under which all innovation must happen now. But there were sort of opportunities, particularly in Teesside, where there's a lot of discussion around hydrogen innovation or becoming a centre for hydrogen innovation. And that includes hydrogen for freight as well. And also the discussion around the Freeports as shipping areas and what happens around the decarbonisation of shipping freight. So there were lots of sort of discussions that kind of link into the Freeport. But really, when we look at the Freeport itself, the main thing that most stakeholders were concerned about was about attracting investment towards creating low carbon technology, whether that's for energy production or for new transport mechanisms. So it was really the kind of the idea of a Freeport as an innovation hub.
How have you understood place to be important in what you found?
Teesside has often been described as a kind of post-industrial place because of the decline of major industries, particularly steel making, and then a sort of brief time in which that was replaced with things like call centres and other kind of service sector work. And then so that sort of post-industrial landscape for the economy, which then declined in part because of the outsourcing of that kind of labour to other parts of the world. And then the sort of 2009 austerity agenda that shrank local government services, very strongly. So it created all kinds of social and economic problems that have piled on top of one another. Tees is a very deep, it's a very deep river where you can bring large container ships directly up through Teesport, right up the river to the industrial site, and so you can use this for export quite easily. So a lot of the features that made it a good place for industry in the past make it a good place for industry now. So again, it's about capturing that sense of optimism around growth and the tsunami of jobs that are coming. There are then also kind of broader questions and things that I'm also very interested in about whether or not those jobs actually filter to local communities that are suffering. Sort of multiple aspects of deprivation. So if you're a school leaver living in Middlesbrough, are you going to get one of these high-tech jobs in the hydrogen industry? And if not, why not? So there's a lot of that. How do you solve all these other social problems that are often seen as more local? So that's a Middlesbrough problem, not a Tees Valley economic growth problem. But of course, these two things are linked. So so when we're talking about place, it depends on what scale of place we talk about, I think, is the other aspect to it. And there is a world away from Middlesbrough town centre to the Freeport down the road in that sense, because the connection, the economic connection and the social development connection isn't quite there yet, I don't think.